They thought silence meant weakness. They mistook restraint for confusion, humility for ignorance, patience for fear. When you chose not to argue, not to explain, not to correct every lie or defend every truth, they quietly congratulated themselves. In their minds, they had outgrown you, outsmarted you, stepped past you. What they never considered was this: sometimes the wisest person in the room speaks last, and sometimes not at all. You see, there is a peculiar strength in choosing to appear unaware. It unsettles proud people because they rely on reaction. They need resistance to confirm their importance. When you gave them none, they assumed you had nothing to give. They believed you didn't see what was happening, didn't understand the games being played, didn't notice the subtle insults or the quiet betrayals. And so, emboldened by your calm, they went further. They revealed more. They exposed themselves completely. There is a difference between being fooled and allowing others to believe they have fooled you. One is ignorance, the other is discernment. You watched patterns instead of words. You listened to actions instead of apologies. While they spoke freely, thinking you were harmless, you were learning the shape of their character. While they celebrated small victories over you, you were stepping back, seeing the entire board, understanding where every move would eventually lead. At first, they laughed, they whispered, they spoke about you with a confidence that only comes from misunderstanding another person entirely. They don't get it, they said. They're slow, too trusting, too soft. What they didn't realize was that softness can be a deliberate posture, not a permanent condition. The lamb is not ignorant of the wolf. It simply knows the moment has not yet come to bare its teeth. Time has a way of exposing truth without your help. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. The plans they made while underestimating you began to crack. The alliances they formed for advantage started to turn brittle. They looked around, confused, wondering how circumstances had changed so completely without your interference. That is when it dawned on them. You had known far more than you ever revealed. The realization is always uncomfortable. It arrives like a cold draft through a closed room. They replay conversations in their minds, searching for signs they missed. They remember your quiet pauses, your gentle nods, your refusal to react. What once felt like stupidity now feels like judgment withheld. They recognize too late that you were not absent from the moment. You were above it, watching patiently as events unfolded exactly as they must. There is a quiet terror in knowing you misjudged someone's depth. It humbles those who pride themselves on cleverness. They begin to wonder how long you knew, how much you saw, and why you chose not to strike back. That question haunts them more than any confrontation ever could, because it forces them to face a truth they despise. You had power, and you chose restraint. You never needed to prove intelligence by winning arguments. You never needed to announce awareness by exposing every lie. You understood that truth, like light, does not need to shout to be seen. It waits, it remains, and when the time is right, it reveals everything at once. By playing dumb, you allowed reality to speak on your behalf. Now they see it, not because you explained yourself, but because life did. They realize the advantage you gained by staying silent, by letting them move freely in their arrogance, by allowing them to underestimate what they could not measure. And in that realization, something breaks, the illusion that they were ever ahead of you. You walk forward unchanged, unbothered, unannounced. They are the ones left looking back, piecing together the moment they misunderstood you. They finally understand why you played dumb, and understanding, in this case, comes far too late to matter. Silence was never weakness, yet it is one of the most common misunderstandings people carry. When you chose not to speak, not to argue, not to interrupt the false confidence of others, they quickly assigned a meaning to your quiet. They assumed your stillness was emptiness. In a world addicted to noise, anyone who does not constantly announce themselves is immediately underestimated. Loudness is mistaken for strength, and composure is mistaken for fear. So when you remained calm, measured, and unprovoked, they believed they had already won. Silence unsettles insecure minds. People who rely on dominance need reaction to feel powerful. They need opposition to validate their importance. When you denied them that satisfaction, they filled the gap with assumptions. They told themselves stories that made them comfortable, that you lacked awareness, that you did not understand what was happening, that you were too timid to respond. This false narrative gave them confidence, and confidence made them careless. They spoke more freely, acted more boldly, and exposed more than they ever intended. What they failed to understand is that silence can be an act of discipline. It takes strength to hold your tongue when you see the truth clearly. It takes self-control to resist the urge to correct every misjudgment, especially when pride demands immediate defense. You were not silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because you understood timing. You knew that words, used too early, often weaken truth rather than strengthen it. By remaining quiet, you allowed others to project their own beliefs onto you. Their assumptions revealed more about them than about you. The arrogant assumed you were inferior. The manipulative assumed you were easy to control. The careless assumed you would never notice. Each assumption was a confession disguised as confidence. While they felt superior, you were learning exactly who they were without them realizing they were being observed. Silence also protected you. Words spoken in emotional moments often become weapons others use later. You chose not to arm those who misunderstood you. By saying less, you preserved clarity. By refusing to explain yourself, you kept your intentions hidden. This restraint was not passivity, it was precision. You were conserving energy, allowing situations to mature until the truth could no longer be denied. People who mistake silence for weakness often reveal their own dependence on control. They believe power must be displayed, asserted, proven. They cannot comprehend strength that does not announce itself. So when you stepped back instead of forward, when you listened instead of reacted, they assumed you were retreating. In reality, you were letting them move unchecked, knowing that unrestrained behavior always exposes itself eventually. Time became your ally. While they grew bolder in their false confidence, their actions accumulated consequences. Their words contradicted themselves. Their behavior left patterns that could not be ignored. What once looked like your absence slowly revealed itself as patience. The same silence they mocked became the space in which their mistakes echoed loudly. Eventually, the illusion collapsed. Confusion replaced confidence. They began to question how things shifted without your interference. That is when realization struck. You had never been unaware. You had simply refused to participate in a game that rewarded ego over truth. Your silence was not surrender, it was refusal to fight on their terms. True strength does not rush to be seen, it waits until it cannot be denied. By allowing others to feel superior, you gave them the rope to reveal themselves fully. And when understanding finally arrived, it arrived with discomfort. They recognized too late that what they called weakness was actually control, and what they called ignorance was discernment. Silence did not make you small, it made them exposed. Restraint is often misunderstood because it looks unimpressive to those who worship impulse. When you chose not to react immediately, not to challenge every false step, not to confront every subtle offense, they interpreted your self-control as a lack of intelligence. In their minds, awareness must be loud and cleverness must announce itself. Since you did neither, they concluded you did not see what was happening. This assumption became their greatest mistake. Restraint requires awareness. One cannot hold back from what one does not perceive. You noticed the tone behind the words, the intention beneath the smiles, the quiet shifts in behavior that revealed far more than open confession ever could. Yet instead of exposing it all at once, you chose discipline. You understood that reacting too quickly often feeds deception rather than ends it. By remaining composed, you allowed truth to continue speaking through their actions. They believed intelligence always corrects, interrupts, and dominates, so when you didn't challenge their inconsistencies or call out their contradictions, they assumed you were unaware. This false belief emboldened them. They spoke more freely, shared opinions they would have hidden, and revealed motives they would have masked if they sensed resistance. What they thought was safety was actually exposure. Your restraint created the illusion of comfort, and comfort loosened their guard. There is a peculiar arrogance in assuming silence means confusion. It reveals how dependent some people are on external validation. They believe understanding must be proven in real time, or it does not exist. You knew better. You understood that clarity grows sharper when it is not rushed. You allowed situations to unfold fully, knowing that incomplete information leads to incomplete judgment. While they rushed to conclusions, you gathered perspective. Restraint also unsettles manipulative minds. Those who seek control rely on predictability. They expect outrage, defense, denial. When none of those reactions appear, they assume emptiness rather than intention. They cannot imagine someone choosing stillness deliberately, so they mislabel it as ignorance. That mislabeling gave you freedom. While they acted boldly, assuming superiority, you moved quietly, understanding the entire structure of the situation. You did not need to prove you were aware, because awareness does not require applause. You recognized that confronting deception too early often drives it underground, where it becomes harder to detect. By allowing it to continue in the open, you saw its full form. You watched how stories changed, how alliances shifted, how confidence turned into carelessness. None of this would have been visible if you had reacted impulsively. Restraint preserved your clarity. Emotional reactions blur judgment. Defensive explanations weaken authority. You avoided both. You allowed others to underestimate you because underestimation removes resistance. It invites honesty from those who believe they are unchallenged. They mistook your calm for dullness, not realizing that composure often signals depth they cannot measure. Over time, the truth revealed itself without your intervention. What they thought you missed became impossible to ignore. Patterns emerged. Consequences followed. The same restraint they dismissed as ignorance became evidence of foresight. They began to replay moments, wondering how long you had known, how much you had seen. That question haunted them because it exposed their own shallow assumptions. Restraint is intelligence applied patiently. It is the refusal to waste energy on premature battles. You did not need to announce your understanding because reality eventually did it for you. When realization arrived, it arrived with discomfort. They recognized too late that what they called ignorance was actually control, and what they dismissed as passivity was strategic awareness. In the end, restraint did not hide your intelligence. It revealed theirs was limited. Choosing not to react created a rare and powerful advantage. It allowed you to observe patterns instead of getting trapped in arguments. Arguments are noisy distractions. They pull attention toward words, excuses, emotions, and performances. Patterns, however, live beneath all of that. They reveal truth slowly, consistently, and without exaggeration. When you refused to engage in constant back and forth, you stepped out of the smoke and saw the fire clearly. Most people believe truth is found in what someone says. In reality, truth is found in what someone repeats. Words can be crafted in the moment, but patterns require consistency, and consistency is difficult to fake. By not reacting, you allowed behavior to continue uninterrupted. You watched how promises changed when circumstances shifted. You noticed how respect appeared only when it was useful. You saw how loyalty vanished when inconvenience arrived. None of this would have been visible if you had stayed locked in debate. Arguments reward quick thinkers, not honest ones. They favor those who speak confidently, not those who speak truthfully. By refusing to argue, you denied others the stage they needed to control the narrative. You did not give them the satisfaction of defending themselves, explaining themselves, or justifying contradictions. Instead, you let their actions speak repeatedly. Over time, those actions formed a clear and undeniable picture. There is also wisdom in understanding that arguments often reset accountability. When people argue, they feel absolved simply because the conflict occurred. Words are exchanged, emotions flare, and afterward everyone feels something was addressed, but nothing truly changes. Patterns, on the other hand, cannot hide behind emotional resolution. They persist, they repeat, they expose intent far more honestly than any heated discussion ever could. By staying quiet, you removed yourself from emotional manipulation. Arguments are often designed to provoke reactions that can later be used against you. Anger becomes evidence. Defense becomes guilt. Explanation becomes weakness. You avoided all of it. You gave no emotional material to be twisted or weaponized. While others focused on winning moments, you focused on understanding trajectories. Watching patterns requires patience, and patience is uncomfortable for people who rely on impulse. They assumed your lack of reaction meant you were unaware of what was happening. This belief made them careless. They stopped editing themselves. They contradicted their own stories. They treated different people in different ways without realizing you were noticing the inconsistency. Each repeated behavior added another piece to the truth you were assembling quietly. Patterns also reveal motive. Anyone can say the right thing once. Anyone can apologize convincingly in the moment. But repeated behavior shows what someone values, what they prioritize, and what they are willing to sacrifice. By stepping back, you saw where effort disappeared, where respect diminished, and where self-interest consistently overruled integrity. These insights are impossible to gain when energy is spent reacting instead of observing. Choosing observation over argument protected your clarity. Emotional engagement clouds perception. When feelings are stirred, judgment narrows. You understood that remaining calm kept your vision wide. You saw not only what was happening to you, but how the same behaviors affected others. You noticed who benefited, who was discarded, and who was only valued when useful. This broader perspective gave you understanding, not just awareness. Eventually, patterns became impossible to ignore, even for those who once dismissed you. What they thought were isolated incidents revealed themselves as habits. What they believed were misunderstandings revealed themselves as consistent choices. And suddenly, your silence no longer looked passive, it looked perceptive. They realized you had not been confused, you had been watching. There is quiet authority in someone who does not rush to conclusions, yet never misses the truth. By choosing patterns over arguments, you allowed reality to testify without interruption. You didn't need to accuse, confront, or explain. The evidence accumulated on its own. and when clarity finally emerged, it carried weight precisely because it was earned through observation, not emotion. Letting others speak freely was one of the most revealing choices you made, because people expose their character most clearly when they believe they are unobserved and unchallenged. When no one interrupts them, corrects them, or questions their motives, they relax into honesty, not the kind they intend to share, but the kind that slips out when confidence replaces caution. Your quiet presence became an open door through which their true nature walked freely. People are careful when they sense resistance. They edit their words, soften their intentions, and wear masks designed to impress or deceive. But when they believe they are safe, when they assume you are unaware, unimpressive, or irrelevant, they stop performing. They speak without fear of consequence. They joke about things that reveal cruelty. They explain decisions that expose selfishness. They justify actions in ways that uncover their moral limits. You didn't need to interrogate them, you simply gave them space to reveal themselves. There is a deep irony here. They thought your silence meant you had nothing to contribute, when in fact you were collecting information they were handing over willingly. Every careless comment, every contradiction, every unnecessary explanation added another layer of clarity. People often reveal more in what they say casually than in what they declare intentionally. You understood this. You allowed conversations to flow, knowing that truth surfaces most easily when it is not being hunted. By not confronting them, you avoided triggering their defenses. Defense is the enemy of revelation. Once people feel threatened, they become strategic. They lie better. They hide deeper. They manipulate more carefully. Your calm removed that threat. They believed they were in control of the narrative, unaware that they were slowly dismantling it themselves. The more comfortable they became, the more transparent they grew. Words spoken without pressure carry a different weight. They are not rehearsed. They are not filtered. They reflect what someone truly believes when they think no judgment is coming. You listened not just to what was said, but how it was said. You noticed tone, timing, and what was emphasized or dismissed. You observed how their values shifted depending on who was present. This kind of insight cannot be gained through confrontation. It requires quiet attention. Letting others speak freely also revealed consistency, or the lack of it. Stories changed, principles bent, opinions evolved conveniently. When someone is honest, their words align over time. When they are not, contradictions multiply. Because you were not arguing, those contradictions remained visible. No one rushed to cover them up. No emotional conflict distracted from them. They simply accumulated, undeniable and clear. There is also something unsettling about being truly heard. Many people speak to be understood, but very few expect to be remembered. You remembered. You noticed patterns in their language, repeated justifications, recurring excuses. Over time, you could predict what they would say before they said it, because character repeats itself. This understanding gave you a calm confidence they mistook for emptiness. They assumed talking freely gave them power. In reality, it gave you clarity. Power gained through words is fragile. Clarity gained through observation is permanent. You didn't need to expose them publicly or correct them privately. Their own words became a record of who they were. And once someone shows you who they are consistently, no explanation can erase that knowledge. Eventually the realization hit them. They sensed a shift in you, not in behavior, but in distance. You were no longer confused, no longer unsure. You were simply done engaging at the level they expected. That is when they began to wonder how much you knew, how long you had known it, and why you never said anything. That question disturbed them more than any accusation ever could. By letting others speak freely, you gave them the stage and the spotlight. They performed exactly as they were. You didn't need to interrupt the performance. You just needed to watch. And in watching, you learned everything you needed to know, without confrontation, without conflict, and without ever revealing how clearly you saw them. Playing dumb was never an accident. It was a conscious choice made from clarity, not confusion. There is a profound difference between lacking understanding and choosing not to display it. You knew exactly what was happening, but you also knew something more important. Revealing your awareness too early would only shift the game, not end it. So you chose invisibility over confrontation. You chose to let others believe they were smarter, quicker, and more aware, because that belief made them predictable. When people think they are dealing with someone unaware, they stop guarding themselves. They no longer calculate every word or hide every intention. They assume superiority, and superiority breeds carelessness. By appearing naive, you removed yourself from suspicion. You were no longer seen as a threat, and that made you powerful in a way they could not recognize. What they mistook for simplicity was actually discipline in disguise. Playing dumb requires self-mastery. It demands that you silence the ego that wants recognition, validation, and immediate justice. It means resisting the urge to prove yourself right or expose someone else wrong. Most people cannot do this. They reveal their intelligence the moment it is questioned. You did the opposite. You concealed it, understanding that intelligence displayed too soon becomes a target. Intelligence concealed becomes an advantage. This choice also protected your peace. When you stop trying to convince people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim enormous emotional energy. You realize that explaining yourself to those who benefit from misjudging you is futile. Their misunderstanding was not accidental. It was convenient. By playing dumb, you refused to feed that convenience. You let them believe what they wanted, knowing belief does not change reality. There is something deeply unsettling about someone who does not defend themselves when falsely judged. It confuses those who rely on emotional reactions to feel in control. They expected outrage, explanation, perhaps desperation. Instead, they got calm, and calm, when misunderstood, looks like weakness. They leaned into that assumption, never realizing it was the very thing allowing you to see everything clearly. Playing dumb also shifted the burden of exposure onto them. When you stop reacting, others keep talking. When you stop correcting, others keep revealing. When you stop performing, others perform more intensely. They tried harder to impress, to dominate, to assert control, and in doing so, they showed you their limits, their insecurities, and their intentions. You didn't need to interrogate them. Their need to feel superior did the work for you. This was not manipulation. It was restraint guided by wisdom. You were not deceiving them. You were simply not enlightening them. There is a moral difference. You did not lie. You did not pretend to be something you were not. You simply withheld access to your depth. And depth, when hidden, frustrates shallow judgment. Over time, your choice created a quiet separation. While they operated on assumptions, you operated on understanding. While they spoke, you listened. While they celebrated small victories, you prepared for long-term clarity. Playing dumb gave you time to see patterns, time to recognize who was safe, time to understand who was not. That time was invaluable. Eventually, the mask fell, not yours, but theirs. Circumstances changed. Consequences appeared. Their confidence faltered, and suddenly they looked at you differently. They sensed something they could not explain. The same person they once dismissed now seemed unreachable, unreadable, unmoved. That is when the realization began to dawn. You had never been unaware. You had simply chosen not to reveal what you knew. Playing dumb was not weakness. It was strategy without cruelty, intelligence without arrogance, power without noise. And when they finally understood this, it was too late to adjust, because the advantage of concealed awareness is that it works quietly, patiently, and irreversibly. Patience allowed time to reveal what words tried desperately to hide. Words can be arranged, rehearsed, softened, and polished. They can sound sincere while masking intention. Time, however, cannot be persuaded. It does not bend to excuses or adjust itself to appearances. By choosing patience, you aligned yourself with the one force that exposes everything without effort. You did not rush the truth, because you understood that truth rushed is often distorted. People who rely on words to control perception fear time more than confrontation. In the short term, a convincing explanation can silence doubt. A confident tone can override suspicion. An emotional apology can reset accountability. But time has a long memory. It watches what repeats, what changes only temporarily, and what never truly improves. You trusted this process. You allowed days, months, and situations to pass without forcing resolution, knowing that consistency would eventually speak louder than persuasion. Patience is often mistaken for indecision because it lacks urgency. Others believed you were unsure, confused, or hesitant. They mistook your refusal to act immediately as an inability to act at all. This misunderstanding worked in your favor. While they continued performing through words, you watched what remained when performance became exhausting. When effort dropped, when attention shifted, when comfort replaced caution, their real intentions surfaced naturally. Time also reveals priorities. When people are honest, their behavior remains steady even when circumstances change. When they are not, their values shift with convenience. You saw how commitments faded when they required sacrifice. You noticed how respect appeared only when it benefited them. You observed how promises weakened when accountability approached. None of this required confrontation. It required waiting, and waiting gave you clarity that no argument ever could. Patience protected you from false conclusions. Immediate reactions often create permanent judgments based on incomplete information. You refused to decide too quickly. You understood that the first version of any story is rarely the truest. By letting time pass, you allowed multiple versions to emerge. Contradictions surfaced, explanations evolved. What once sounded reasonable began to feel rehearsed. Over time, the gaps became impossible to ignore. There is also a quiet discipline in allowing time to do its work. It means resisting the urge to seek closure prematurely. It means tolerating discomfort while others misunderstand your silence. You endured that discomfort because you valued accuracy over relief. You knew that peace built on illusion collapses quickly, while peace built on truth lasts. So you waited, not passively, but attentively. Those who tried to shape narratives through words underestimated time's loyalty to truth. They believed that if enough was said, enough would be believed. But repetition without integrity eventually turns against itself. Stories become heavy to maintain. Justifications grow complex. Small lies require larger ones to survive. Time exposed this weight. You watched as their confidence eroded under the burden of maintaining appearances. Patience also revealed how people behaved when they thought the moment had passed. Early on they were careful. Later they relaxed. What people do when they think scrutiny has ended is often the clearest reflection of who they are. You noticed changes in tone, effort, and respect. These changes were not accidents. They were disclosures. Time stripped away the need to impress. While they spoke to control outcomes, you allowed outcomes to speak for themselves. Events unfolded. Consequences appeared. Alignment shifted. What once required explanation became self-evident. and when clarity finally emerged, it carried authority because it was undeniable. No argument was needed, no defense required. Time had already delivered the verdict. In the end, patience did not delay truth. It refined it. What words attempted to disguise, time exposed without mercy or emotion. You did not need to rush understanding, because understanding ripens naturally when left alone. By trusting time, you chose depth over drama, certainty over speed, and truth over temporary relief. And that choice ensured that when realization arrived, it arrived complete, unarguable, and final. Underestimation encouraged others to overstep, and in doing so, they created their own undoing. When people believe they are smarter, stronger, or more capable than someone else, they begin to act without restraint. Boundaries feel unnecessary, caution feels excessive, respect feels optional. They assume there will be no consequences because they believe you are either unaware or powerless to respond. That belief becomes permission for carelessness, for arrogance, and eventually for mistakes they cannot reverse. The moment they decided you were beneath them, they stopped measuring their behavior. Small disrespect crept in first, disguised as jokes, subtle dismissals, or casual neglect. Because you did not react, they took that silence as approval. What they didn't realize was that silence was not acceptance, it was observation. Each overstep was noted, not emotionally, but clearly. You were not collecting grievances, you were collecting evidence of character. Underestimation removes self-discipline from people who rely on ego. When they feel superior, they stop self-correcting. They say things they would normally hide, they take risks they would normally avoid, they test limits simply because they believe no one is watching closely enough to hold them accountable. Your calm presence gave them false safety. They mistook your composure for incapacity, and that misjudgment allowed them to reveal far more than they ever intended. Mistakes multiply when arrogance replaces awareness. They began contradicting themselves, forgetting what they had promised, changing stories to suit the moment. Because you were not confronting them, these inconsistencies remained visible. No argument distracted from them. No emotional conflict blurred them. Over time, their behavior formed a pattern of overconfidence followed by carelessness. That pattern spoke louder than any accusation ever could. There is a dangerous freedom people feel when they believe they are unchallenged. They stop refining their actions. They stop questioning their motives. They stop fearing consequences. That freedom is not strength, it is exposure. You allowed them that freedom. You didn't interfere, you didn't warn them, you didn't correct them, and in doing so, you let them walk further and further away from restraint, until turning back became impossible. Underestimation also revealed who they became when they believed they had the upper hand. Power, even imagined power, exposes truth. Some became cruel, some became dismissive, some became reckless, others became greedy with advantage. These were not new traits, they were dormant ones, activated by the belief that they were safe from accountability. You saw not just what they did to you, but what they would do to anyone they believed was beneath them. Each overstep deepened their confidence and weakened their position. They mistook short-term advantage for permanent control. They believed winning moments meant winning outcomes. You understood something they didn't. Unchecked behavior always leaves traces. Words spoken carelessly are remembered. Actions taken lightly are eventually weighed. They were too busy enjoying the illusion of dominance to realize they were building a record against themselves. You never needed to push them into error. Their own assumptions did that work for you. When people underestimate someone, they reveal how little they understand about restraint, patience, and foresight. They assume strength must be visible and intelligence must be proven immediately. Because you showed neither, they assumed absence. That assumption allowed them to act openly, repeatedly, and without fear. Eventually, the mistakes reached a point where they could not be explained away. Consequences appeared, not because you forced them, but because reality demands balance. What once looked like confidence began to look like irresponsibility. What once felt like control began to feel like chaos. And slowly they realized that their downfall was not sudden. It was accumulated step by step through moments they believed did not matter. That realization is deeply unsettling. They begin to see that every overstep was unnecessary, every assumption reckless, every dismissal costly. They understand too late that the person they underestimated was not passive but patient, not unaware but observant, not weak but disciplined. Underestimation did not protect them, it exposed them, and by the time they recognized that truth, their mistakes were already complete, irreversible, and entirely their own doing. Quiet observation gave you a full view of the situation, not just the fragments people wanted you to see. When others react quickly, they only ever grasp pieces, isolated moments, emotional flashes, carefully presented explanations. You chose distance instead of immediacy, and that distance widened your vision. You were not pulled into single incidents or dramatic scenes. You saw continuity. You saw cause and effect. You saw how one action quietly prepared the ground for the next. Most misunderstandings are born from partial sight. People judge too early because they feel pressured to decide before they truly understand. You refused that pressure. By observing silently, you allowed the entire picture to form. You noticed how certain behaviors only appeared under specific conditions, how kindness vanished when it no longer served a purpose, how confidence increased when accountability was absent. These were not accidents. They were pieces of a larger pattern only visible to someone who was not emotionally entangled. Stepping back also freed you from the narrow lens of self-interest. When people are personally attacked or emotionally triggered, their focus shrinks to survival. They stop seeing what is happening around them. You avoided that trap. By remaining calm, you could see how others were treated when no one was watching, how power shifted in different rooms, how narratives changed depending on the audience. You understood the environment, not just your place within it. A full view requires stillness. Movement creates distortion. Noise blurs detail. You stayed still long enough for reality to sharpen. You noticed small inconsistencies others dismissed as irrelevant. You paid attention to what was avoided rather than what was emphasized. Silence allowed you to hear what was never said. An observation revealed what words tried to distract from. This kind of awareness does not come from cleverness, it comes from restraint. While others focused on winning moments, you focused on outcomes. They celebrated short-term advantages without realizing how unstable those advantages were. You saw the cracks forming long before they became visible. You recognized how fragile alliances were, how dependent certain people were on perception rather than substance. You understood that anything built on illusion requires constant maintenance, and you knew that sooner or later exhaustion exposes weakness. Quiet observation also gave you emotional neutrality, and emotional neutrality gave you accuracy. You were not invested in being right in the moment, you were invested in being right in the end. That difference mattered. It allowed you to revise your understanding as new information appeared. You were not trapped defending a position you had already announced. You could adjust silently, refining your perception without resistance or pride. From this wider perspective, you also saw timing. You understood when intervention would have been premature and when silence was more powerful than response. Many people act too early, driven by discomfort rather than wisdom. You waited until the situation revealed its true shape. And because you waited, you did not misjudge intentions or underestimate consequences. You saw where things were heading long before they arrived there. Having the full view also meant recognizing your own role clearly. You were not blinded by victimhood or ego. You could see where you needed to step back, where you needed to protect yourself, and where engagement would only create unnecessary damage. This clarity allowed you to move without resentment. You didn't need revenge or validation. Understanding itself became enough. Others mistook your distance for detachment, your calm for indifference. In reality, you were deeply aware. You simply refused to let emotion hijack perception, and that refusal gave you something rare, certainty without chaos. While others were reacting to fragments, you were responding to reality as a whole. Eventually, the difference became obvious. When confusion spread, you were clear. When narratives collapsed, you were steady. When others scrambled to explain what went wrong, you already knew. That is the quiet power of seeing the entire picture. You didn't guess. You didn't assume. You observed, and when the moment came to move forward, you did so without hesitation, because you weren't acting on fragments. You were acting on truth, complete, tested, and undeniable. Withholding judgment protected your inner peace and preserved your strength in ways others never noticed. Judgment is heavy. It drains energy, sharpens resentment, and ties your emotional state to the behavior of people who may not deserve that influence. By refusing to rush into conclusions, you kept your inner world intact. You did not allow their actions to dictate your mood, your identity, or your sense of balance. Most people believe judgment brings control, but it often brings the opposite. The moment you label someone too quickly, you become emotionally invested in proving yourself right. You begin reacting instead of choosing. You replay conversations, imagine confrontations, and carry unresolved tension long after the moment has passed. You avoided that trap. By suspending judgment, you stayed light, free, and clear-headed, while others exhausted themselves defending their assumptions. Preserving peace does not mean denying reality. It means refusing to poison yourself with premature conclusions. You acknowledged what you observed without turning it into anger or obsession. This restraint kept your perception sharp. When emotions flare, clarity fades. You understood that the clearest mind is the one least desperate to reach a verdict. So you waited, allowing understanding to deepen without forcing resolution. Withholding judgment also protected your strength from unnecessary battles. Not every truth requires immediate confrontation. Not every wrong requires your energy. You chose carefully where to invest yourself. While others burned themselves out arguing, defending, or correcting, you conserved strength. You remained capable while they became reactive. Strength preserved is strength available when it truly matters. There is also dignity in refusing to judge too soon. It signals confidence, not uncertainty. You did not need to announce conclusions to feel secure. You trusted your ability to discern without display. This quiet confidence unsettled those who expected outrage or defensiveness. They could not provoke you into emotional exposure, and that denial stripped them of leverage. Judgment often locks people into rigid perspectives. Once declared, it becomes difficult to revise without losing face. You avoided this rigidity. By remaining internally flexible, you could adjust your understanding as new information emerged. This adaptability is a form of intelligence rarely appreciated by those who value certainty over accuracy. You chose accuracy, Protecting your inner peace also meant refusing to carry responsibility that wasn't yours. Judgment often disguises itself as moral duty, but it can become a burden. You did not take ownership of fixing, exposing, or correcting everyone. You understood that people reveal themselves over time without your intervention. By letting that process unfold, you stayed free of bitterness. Preserved strength also meant emotional availability for what truly mattered. Instead of wasting energy on resentment, you invested it in growth, awareness, and preparation. While others fixated on controlling perception, you focused on building stability within yourself. That stability became your advantage when circumstances shifted. Eventually, those who judged hastily found themselves trapped by their own declarations. They could not retreat without embarrassment. You, however, moved effortlessly because you had never bound yourself to premature conclusions. Your calm was not ignorance, it was discipline. Withholding judgment did not make you indifferent, it made you resilient. It allowed you to stay composed while others unraveled. It preserved your strength for moments that demanded action, not reaction. And when clarity finally arrived, you met it with calm certainty rather than emotional chaos. Inner peace is not the absence of awareness, it is the presence of control. And by choosing not to judge too soon, you protected both your peace and your power. Power was shown through restraint rather than retaliation, and that truth unsettled everyone who expected noise instead of control. Most people believe power announces itself. They expect dominance to be loud, immediate, and unmistakable. They believe strength must strike back to be real. When you didn't retaliate, they assumed you lacked the ability to do so. What they failed to understand was that restraint is not the absence of power. It is power held in reserve. Retaliation is easy. It requires no discipline, no foresight, no patience. It is the instinctive response of wounded pride and unchecked emotion. You chose something far more difficult. You chose to master yourself instead of reacting to others. That choice alone placed you in a position of quiet authority. Anyone can lash out. Very few can remain composed while being underestimated, provoked, or wronged. By not retaliating, you denied others the conflict they were prepared for. Many people provoke precisely because they want reaction. Reaction validates their importance. It gives them control over the emotional direction of the situation. When you refused to play that role, you removed their leverage. They could not escalate because there was nothing to push against. Your restraint became an immovable wall, and that frustrated them more than any counterattack ever could. Restraint also preserved your credibility. Retaliation often muddies truth. Once emotions erupt, motives are questioned, intentions are blurred, and responsibility becomes shared. You avoided that confusion. By staying measured, you kept the moral ground steady beneath your feet. When the dust eventually settled, it was clear who had acted from impulse and who had acted from control. Silence, in this case, became testimony. There is also a deeper kind of power in knowing you could respond, but choosing not to. That awareness strengthens resolve. It sharpens judgment. You were not helpless. You were deliberate. You assessed consequences instead of chasing momentary satisfaction. You understood that retaliation often feels like relief, but leaves lasting damage. Restraint, though uncomfortable in the moment, builds long-term advantage. Those who expected retaliation mistook your composure for defeat. They believed the absence of resistance meant victory. This illusion gave them false confidence. They overextended. They spoke too freely. They assumed immunity. In reality, your restraint was allowing the situation to mature until the truth stood on its own. You didn't need to strike back. Time was already doing the work more thoroughly than anger ever could. Power expressed through restraint also reshaped how others perceived you. At first, they dismissed you. Later, they grew uncertain. Eventually, they became uneasy. Someone who cannot be provoked cannot be controlled. Someone who refuses to retaliate on demand does not operate on emotional strings. That realization shifts dynamics quietly but permanently. You are no longer predictable, and unpredictability unsettles those who rely on manipulation. Restraint demanded sacrifice. You sacrificed the immediate satisfaction of being right. You sacrificed the comfort of public defense. You endured misunderstanding without correction, but in doing so, you gained something far more valuable: sovereignty over yourself. Your actions were not dictated by insult, betrayal, or ego. They were chosen. That is real power. Over time, the contrast became undeniable. While others exhausted themselves with reaction, you remained steady. While they escalated, you conserved. While they exposed their insecurities through aggression, you revealed confidence through calm. The very people who once dismissed you began to sense the imbalance. They realized too late that retaliation was never your weakness. It was something you consciously refused. True power does not need to announce itself through force. It reveals itself through control. By choosing restraint over retaliation, you demonstrated mastery where others showed impulse. And mastery, once recognized, cannot be undone, because it was never dependent on noise to begin with. Truth unfolded naturally without the need for explanation or defense, because truth does not require constant supervision. Lies must be maintained, protected, and repeatedly reinforced. Truth, once released into time, moves on its own. You understood this, and that understanding freed you from the exhausting task of proving yourself. You did not stand on trial defending your intentions. You let reality testify. Explaining yourself would have pulled you into a debate shaped by their terms. Defense would have suggested guilt where none existed. You refused both. You recognized that when you rush to explain, you often end up clarifying confusion that was never honest in the first place. Some misunderstandings are deliberate. They are designed to force you into overexposure, into saying more than necessary, into weakening your position through excessive justification. You chose silence instead, and that silence allowed truth to breathe. Truth reveals itself through consistency. Over time, what is real remains steady, while what is false begins to wobble. You trusted that process. You did not rush to correct every false assumption or counter every distorted narrative. You understood that people who genuinely seek understanding will notice patterns on their own, and those who do not were never listening to explanations anyway, so you saved your breath. Defending oneself often shifts attention away from facts and toward emotions. Once emotions take center stage, clarity disappears. You avoided that trap. By remaining composed, you kept the focus where it belonged, on actions, outcomes, and repeated behavior. As time passed, explanations became unnecessary because evidence accumulated quietly, situations resolved themselves, contradictions surfaced, and what once required words became obvious without them. There is also humility in trusting truth to stand alone. It requires faith, not in people's opinions, but in reality itself. You accepted that not everyone would understand immediately. You accepted being misunderstood temporarily rather than distorting yourself for approval. This patience allowed truth to arrive intact rather than weakened by argument or emotional defense. When you stop defending yourself, something subtle happens. Pressure shifts. The burden moves from you to those who are misrepresenting reality. They must now maintain consistency. They must keep stories aligned. They must remember what they said before. This is difficult. Over time, the effort shows. Small cracks appear. Explanations grow longer, justifications become complex. Meanwhile, you remain simple, steady, unchanged. That contrast is powerful. Truth also has a way of reaching people indirectly. You didn't need to convince anyone one by one. Circumstances spoke, outcomes spoke, consequences spoke. Others began to notice without you pointing anything out. When recognition arrives through observation rather than persuasion, it carries more weight. It feels earned, not imposed. You allowed that to happen by staying quiet. Not defending yourself protected your integrity. Defense can sometimes blur lines, forcing you to simplify complex truths or compromise accuracy just to be understood. You refused to reduce yourself for comfort. You allowed complexity to exist without apology. Over time, those capable of understanding did so. Those who weren't never mattered. There is strength in knowing when silence serves truth better than speech. You recognized that explanations can sometimes delay understanding by giving people something to argue with. Silence gives them nothing to fight, only something to notice, and noticing, once it begins, cannot be stopped by debate. Eventually, the need for explanation disappeared entirely. The situation clarified itself. The narrative corrected itself. People saw what they needed to see, not because you told them, but because reality showed them. And when that moment came, your silence was no longer questioned, it was understood. Truth does not need a lawyer when time is the judge. You trusted that. You stepped back. You let events unfold. And in doing so, you proved something quietly, but completely. The strongest position is often the one that requires no defense at all. The realization of being misjudged unsettled those who relied on arrogance, because arrogance depends on certainty, and certainty collapses the moment it is questioned. For a long time they were comfortable. They had built a version of you in their minds that made sense to them. Small enough to dismiss, simple enough to ignore, predictable enough to control. That version allowed them to feel superior without effort. It allowed them to move through situations with confidence, believing they understood everything that mattered. When that belief began to crack, it disturbed them deeply. At first, the discomfort was subtle, a passing doubt, a strange hesitation, a moment where your calm no longer felt empty but unreadable. They started noticing things that didn't fit their assumptions. Your silence no longer looked lost. Your distance no longer looked defeated. It looked intentional, and intentionality is threatening to those who rely on dominance because it suggests depth they failed to account for. Arrogance survives by simplifying others. It reduces people to labels: weak, naive, slow, irrelevant. These labels make the world easier to manage. They remove uncertainty. But when someone you've simplified refuses to behave according to the role you assigned them, confusion sets in. They began replaying moments in their minds, searching for clues they missed. Conversations took on new meanings. Pauses felt heavier. What they once ignored now demanded explanation. The most unsettling part was realizing that the misjudgment was not mutual. You had seen them clearly while they had not seen you at all. That imbalance created quiet fear. It meant the power dynamic they trusted was imaginary. It meant their confidence had been built on a false foundation, and people who rely on arrogance fear nothing more than discovering they are not as perceptive as they believed. This realization wounded their pride. Pride does not heal easily because it resists humility. Admitting misjudgment would require admitting limitation. It would mean accepting that they overlooked intelligence, restraint, and awareness because they were too focused on asserting themselves. Instead of feeling superior, they now felt exposed. Not exposed by you, but by their own assumptions. They began to question their instincts. If they were wrong about you, what else were they wrong about? This question lingers painfully for arrogant minds. It destabilizes their sense of control. They can no longer trust their first impressions or quick judgments. The ease with which they once navigated interactions disappears. Confidence becomes cautious. Speech becomes measured. They realize too late that arrogance blinded them to complexity. What unsettled them most was the absence of your response. You did not correct them. You did not confront them with their mistake. You did not seek satisfaction in their discomfort. Your silence forced them to sit with the realization alone. There was no argument to deflect blame onto, no conflict to frame as mutual misunderstanding, just a quiet awareness that they had misread someone who never needed to prove themselves. Arrogance thrives on comparison. It needs someone to be beneath it. When that structure collapses, it leaves emptiness behind. They could no longer feel elevated by diminishing you. That loss created insecurity. They began watching you more closely, trying to understand what they missed, trying to reclaim certainty. But by then, certainty was gone. There is a particular discomfort in realizing that someone you underestimated never needed your recognition. You did not change. You did not reveal anything new. You simply remained yourself. And in doing so, you forced them to confront the limits of their perception. They understood that their judgment was shallow, rushed, and driven by ego rather than insight. This realization also carried regret. Not the kind that seeks repair, but the kind that knows an opportunity for understanding was lost. They recognized that had they approached you with humility instead of arrogance, the dynamic might have been different, but arrogance rarely allows second chances. By the time it recognizes its error, the moment has already passed. You move forward unaffected, while they were left recalibrating. That contrast was sharp. You did not gain power by their discomfort. You simply revealed that you never depended on their opinion. And that independence was what unsettled them most of all. Being misjudged is painful, but realizing you misjudged someone else is humbling in a way arrogance cannot tolerate. They learned that lesson quietly, internally, and without your involvement. And that is why it stayed with them, because it could not be argued away, only accepted. Moving forward without announcing victory proved that awareness never needed validation. You did not pause to explain yourself once clarity arrived. You did not collect apologies, seek recognition, or wait for others to admit they were wrong. You simply continued. That quiet continuation said more than any declaration ever could. It demonstrated that your understanding had never been dependent on agreement, and your strength had never required an audience. Most people crave acknowledgement at the end of conflict. They want the moment where others finally see, finally admit, finally concede. That desire is understandable, but it also reveals dependence. You refused that dependency. You understood that requiring validation would place your peace back into the hands of those who had already misjudged you once. So you chose a cleaner ending. No speeches, no explanations, no triumph, just movement. There is something profoundly unsettling about someone who does not seek closure from those who doubted them. It removes the final illusion of control. Others expect a reaction, relief, satisfaction, perhaps even quiet pride. Instead, they find absence. You are already gone, mentally and emotionally, before the realization fully lands for them. That absence confirms what they most feared. You were never waiting for their understanding. By moving forward silently, you preserved your dignity. Victory announced often sounds like revenge in disguise. It seeks to reverse the power dynamic by humiliating the other side. You had no interest in that. You did not need to prove they were wrong to feel right. Your awareness was complete long before they caught up. Continuing without comment showed that your growth was internal, not reactive. Silence after clarity is a form of maturity. It says, "I see clearly now, and that is enough." You did not rewrite the past to make others uncomfortable. You did not weaponize your understanding. You simply adjusted your position, your boundaries, your direction. That adjustment was the message. Those paying attention understood it immediately. Those who weren't never mattered. Validation is often sought by those who doubt themselves. You didn't. You trusted your perception long before it was confirmed externally. That trust allowed you to walk away without bitterness. You didn't need acknowledgement to heal, because your healing was not dependent on their awareness. You did not measure success by being seen as right, but by being at peace. Moving forward also meant refusing to reopen doors for the sake of explanation. You understood that explanations invite debate, and debate invites distortion. You had no interest in reliving what you had already outgrown. Your silence protected the progress you made while others were still processing the past. You chose momentum over satisfaction. There is power in ending a chapter without punctuation. No dramatic exit, no final word, just a turning of the page. That kind of ending cannot be argued with or undone. It leaves nothing to respond to. It simply exists. And existence, when grounded in clarity, is the strongest statement of all. Those who eventually realized the truth were left alone with it. You did not guide them to understanding. You did not soften the realization or sharpen it. You allowed it to arrive on its own terms. That autonomy made it heavier for them, because it could not be blamed on your influence. They had to sit with the knowledge that they misread you while you moved on unchanged. Continuing without validation also protected your future. You did not anchor your next steps to old misunderstandings. You did not define yourself in opposition to those who underestimated you. You defined yourself independently. That independence ensured that your growth was not reactive, but authentic. You were not moving away from them. You were moving toward yourself. In the end, awareness proved itself through direction, not declaration. You did not need applause, acknowledgement, or correction to confirm what you knew. You simply lived accordingly. And that is the quiet truth most people miss. The strongest awareness does not demand to be seen. It reveals itself in where you go next, how lightly you travel, and how little you need others to understand in order to continue. In the end, nothing about you changed, only their understanding did. You were never unaware, never behind, never lost in confusion. You simply chose composure over noise, observation over reaction, and patience over pride. While others rushed to be seen, you waited to see clearly, and that choice shaped everything. What unsettles people most is not being outsmarted, but realizing they misread someone who never tried to impress them. You did not expose the truth aggressively. You allowed it to surface naturally. You did not demand recognition. You walked forward without it. That quiet certainty is what lingers long after words fade. They now understand why you played dumb, not because you explained it, but because time revealed it. You were never playing at all, you were discerning, and discernment, once revealed, does not need to announce itself. It simply moves on, leaving behind clarity where arrogance once stood, and peace where noise once lived.